So thank you very much for coming today. We're really excited to have you here for the launch of our latest report, which is called Racism, Mental Health and Pre-Crime Policing, the Ethics of Vulnerability Support Hubs. And the report was co-authored by Dr. Hilary, Aked, Dr. Tarek Younis, and Dr. Charlotte Heath Kelly, all of whom are here today with us. So if you're thinking of tweeting about today's training, please do use the #EndPrevent hashtag hopefully both, tag us at Medact in your tweet. So firstly, my name is Rima Buhaya and I'm the campaigns and policy lead, working specifically on peace and security issues. And I'm going to start off with just some technical details for today's training, which my colleague Ben will hopefully be putting up on your screen as well. So firstly, you'll have noticed that all members of the audience aren't able to unmute or share video. And that's because we're asking for comments to be placed in the chat box and questions in the Q&A box. And as I said before, do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box, which you can find below. And just so you know, because I know you can't see it, but we already have nearly 100 people here with us today, which is really amazing. I also would like to invite you to use the separate Q&A function, which will remain open throughout the webinar today, to ask any questions you may have, which we hope to get to in the final half an hour of this talk. So you can find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And as you can see, you can also choose to send a question anonymously. I don't know, Ben, if you can skip to the next slide. So you can choose to send the question anonymously if you'd rather not have it read out with your name attached to it. Please do use the Q&A function for questions and not comments, and try to direct all the questions into the Q&A box rather than into the chat box. We will be recording today's event, but as I said before, if you would rather not have your name attached to a question, please do check the anonymous box in the Q&A. If you're having any technical issues, please do say so in the chat box during my intro, and my colleague Ben, who is flagged as tech on your screen, is here today to help. And you can also email office@medact.org. Great. Okay, so for those of you who are coming across Medact for the first time today, Medact's an organization that works with health workers to do research and evidence-based campaigning to challenge the root causes of global and public health inequalities. We work on issues ranging from climate change, peace and security issues, economic injustice, and migration. Last year, we published a report called False Positives, the Prevent Counter-Extremism Policy in Healthcare, which was again authored by our research manager, Dr. Hilary, Aked. And this report that we're launching today is a follow-on from that and is a contribution to our now growing body of evidence on the impacts of securitizing policies in health services. So I won't go into detail about the findings of that report, mostly because we just don't have the time for that today. So I don't want to take up the time when we should hear from our speakers. But I'm sure that in the following talks, we will hear about Prevent and the ways in which it is linked to and interacts with the vulnerability support hubs that the report that's being launched today is about. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce you to our panel of speakers. So first, we'll be hearing from Dr. Hilary Aked, who's Medact's research manager and a co-author of the report. They're also an investigative researcher with a background in political sociology. Afterwards, we'll be joined by Vicki Nash, who is the head of policy, campaigns, and public affairs at the mental health charity Mind. And then we'll have one of the report's co-authors, Dr. Tarek Younis, who is now a regular speaker for us at Medact. Tarek's a clinical psychologist, researcher, and lecturer in psychology at Middlesex University. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from one of the report's co-authors, Dr. Charlotte Heath Kelly, who is a reader in politics and international studies at the University of Warwick. So after that, we'll aim to have a 30-minute Q&A session. And it's just, I just want to remind you again to please ask questions in the chat. No, that you please don't ask questions in the chat box, and that you ask them instead in the Q&A box. And if you have comments, to put those in the chat box. And please do, if you're tweeting about the event today, please do use the hashtag #EndPrevent or tag @Medact in any of your tweets today. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be able to invite Hilary to start speaking. Thanks, Hilary.
Thanks so much, Reem, and hi everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight. So I've got a lot to whiz through. There's a lot to say about these hubs, so apologies if I'm speaking quite fast. Obviously, please go read the report to digest it at your own pace. So just for a bit of context, I think a lot of people will already know the basics of Prevent, but in case you don't, in 2015, the government passed the Counterterrorism Security Act, which made it a legal duty for a range of public bodies, including NHS trusts, to have due regard for the need to prevent people being drawn into terrorism. The key thing to remember is it's a pre-crime program based on very ill-defined concepts like extremism and radicalization, which I won't talk about now because Tarek, I think, is going to touch on them later. But the important thing to understand is that the result of these vague, unhelpful and meaningless concepts really is that the people getting referred to Prevent are those who are perceived to be liable to quote unquote radicalization, perceived to be potentially violent. And that's two main groups, firstly Muslims and people of color, and secondly people with mental health conditions because of stigma in society. And especially if you're a Muslim with mental health conditions, you know, you're in danger of getting referred to Prevent. Now, in 2016, police noticed that data on people getting referred to Prevent. Am I going to be, sorry to interrupt my spiel, but am I going to be, I can't see myself on the screen. Is that, should I be able to see myself? Not that people need to see my face, but I'll just carry on, sorry. I
think
no
you're
time
fine.
to waste. Huh?
It's fine, yeah, you're fine. I can see you.
Okay. So in 2016, police noticed that about half people getting referred to Prevent, they thought had mental health conditions. But rather admit that the issue might be that Prevent simply fuels stigma against Muslims, against people with mental health conditions. And Tarek's going to talk about racism and Islamophobia, as I said, and Vicki from Mind is going to talk about stigma, so I won't go into that. But what police instead thought was like, oh, we're onto something here. You know, obviously mental health, you know, is a factor in radicalization. So let's set up a new project to sort of look into that and to manage that. So next slide, please. So in 2016, they piloted a project, with 3 hubs, one in the north, Greater Manchester Police, one in the West Midlands, the Central Hub, and one in the south, the Metropolitan Police. And they're working with the NHS Trust shown in this slide, and in addition, Greater Manchester Mental Health NHS Foundation Trust. And what these hubs do is they embed consultant psychiatrists, psychologists and mental health nurses within counterterrorism units. So for example, in the Metropolitan Police one, SO15, their counterterrorism command, is where these NHS staff are based, and they're subject to tight security vetting before they get employed there. And so these healthcare professionals are working in highly securitized environments in which counterterrorism police are firmly in charge. This is a counterterrorism police-led project, and this is where the ethical issues arise. Next slide, please. Before I talk more about what the hubs do and what those ethical issues that are raised are, I just want to explain how we heard about them and how we investigated them. I think it's important. So despite their unique role within UK counterterrorism apparatus, very little was known about what the hubs do. Their activities largely remained shrouded in secrecy with very limited publicly available information. And so their work has therefore been subject to basically no or very little scrutiny from the media, from scholars, from the public. And this lack of transparency is itself a major ethical issue because it severely limits the possibilities for proper accountability. And I think this is the result of quite deliberate secrecy on the part of counterterrorism police. So on the left here, you've got the one media article about the project, which is from Reuters back in 2017, and it talks about how secretive the project is, and it talks about how psychiatrists were told explicitly by the Office for Security and Counterterrorism within the Home Office not to disclose details of their findings ahead of a final report. And that final report was supposed to be published shortly after the Reuters article in November 2017, but it never was. And so when we asked counterterrorism police about it, or for that report, sorry, in December 2019 for the first time, they actually said for quite a while they didn't hold any relevant information. So that's our freedom of information at the top, request at the top there, and that's the National Police Chiefs Council saying at first that they didn't hold any information. Eventually that changed, but it took more than a year to get this data, and we had to go to the Information Commissioner's Office, which issued decision notice. And interestingly, 2.5 weeks after they were forced finally to disclose these documents, the police issued a document about what they're now calling the Vulnerability Support Service, or VSS, which includes this table on the right, which I don't know if you can read it, but it's a whole list of unethical practices that the hubs definitely will not do. But our report, raises concerns that actually they are doing just that. So the key point is that counterterrorism police are resisting scrutiny, I think because they know that the practices at these hubs are highly ethically dubious, and we believe it's urgent that there's ethical scrutiny of these hubs, and now that we have the evidence, we believe that they should be shut down. Next slide, please. So now in public, the establishment of these hubs, to the extent that there was any public information, was substantially premised on the very questionable idea that there's the meaningful association between poor mental health and terrorism. And it was also claimed that the hubs would increase access to mental health services for vulnerable individuals. So they're being pitched as this wonderful social good, and it would result in early intervention and improve health outcomes, and also achieve cost efficiency savings. However, when you look at the internal documents, a different picture emerges, and it seems very clear that the hubs are not about mental health care. So this graph on the top shows that in the North Hub, the majority of people referred were already in the healthcare system when they got referred to Prevent and then to the hubs. The one on the left shows that from the North Hub, the vast majority of people were already known to mental health services. So this is not the hubs helping them get in touch with mental health services. And on the bottom right, this quote is from the Central Hub, and the #1 recommendation at the end of the pilot period was to clarify what on earth they're doing, because they're not clear if it's about spotting mental health or mitigating risk. And the answer is actually, the project is about mitigating the perceived counterterrorism risk posed by the individuals referred. And it bears repeating that none of these individuals have been referred because they have committed a crime. It's on the basis of suspicion alone. It's a pre-crime program. And the hubs exercise this risk management function, which is their real function, in two main ways, which I'll talk a little bit more about very quickly and shortly. Firstly, they are a way to facilitate police access to health information, and I'll explain how that works. And secondly, they're a channel for police to exert influence on mainstream mental health services. Next slide, please. So why do we think that hubs are concerning? Well, they've existed for 5 years now, and about 4,000 people have been assessed, some as young as 6 years old. And despite the lack of independent evaluation, the police are currently rolling this out nationally via what they call Project Cicero. And our report raises serious concerns about a number of issues based on the evidence and the documents we obtained. These issues are mental health, stigma, and Islamophobia, which, as I said, Vicki and Tarek after me are going to discuss. Pathologization, essentially the use of sub-diagnostic thresholds and the dangerous move towards, potentially treating radical or extremist views, quote unquote, as a mental health condition, and Charlotte's going to cover that later. The influence of spurious and racist, frankly, pre-crime security concerns on mental health treatment. So things like mental health assessments conducted in the presence of police, intensified monitoring of patient medication regimes, and based on very dubious counterterrorism concerns, and even decisions to detain people under the Mental Health Act. And I'll show you a slide on that shortly. Health workers are also being pressurized to act beyond their remit. So they're being asked to help assess individuals' likely future counterterrorism risk, because they use combined mental health and counterterrorism risk gradings. They're engaging in what appears to be quote unquote de-radicalization work, which is a very dubious scientific validity. And finally, health workers are being pressurized to surveil and monitor patients. And I'll show you a slide on that shortly. A few final things is they appear to be a means for coercively undermining individuals' right to refuse de-radicalization. I'll show you a case on that. Confidentiality and is another big issue, and I'll show you a case on that. I'm actually aware that I'm running out of time, so if we can go to the next slide, I'll just whiz through in each of these slides what it shows you. Here's a case of a person with psychosis who had been receiving home treatment. Police decide that there are some unacceptable unknowns in this person's case, and they press for this person to receive secure admission to a hospital and prevent discharge. Now, we think this sounds a lot like counterterrorism police strong-arming health professionals, and health professionals do take into account police concerns about risk, but unacceptable unknown, unknown information is not the kind of information they would normally take into account. Next slide, please. I'm running out of time.
Wait, I'm just gonna, Hill, just so you know, you can take another 5 minutes. It's fine.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll stop talking so fast.
I was under time. Yeah, I just want to say.
Oh, thank you. Great. So here's some stuff about how health workers are being co-opted into surveillance. You can see these quotes that litter the documents about, the need for sophisticated health and police eyes. In the first quote. In the second, it says very explicitly that mental health teams could be asked to monitor patients' behaviors, for example, things they say, things they do. And in the third slide, this is referred to as establishing tripwires. So basically impressing upon health workers that, if a patient does or says a certain thing, that has to trigger re-referral to prevent. So the report talks about how that actually could prevent rehabilitation for certain categories of racialized people when they have a mental health relapse or something. Okay, next slide, please. This is an example of what we think looks like potential coercion at the hubs. It's really quite worrying. It's about a case study about an individual with diagnosis of schizophrenia who previously failed to engage with treatment and also failed to engage with Channel. That's the government's quote unquote de-radicalization program. And what happens is this person is verbally abusing ethnic minorities and has had an escalation in his behavior, as they phrase it. He's sectioned under the Mental Health Act and treated, and following treatment is now suddenly willing to engage in the Channel process. So, we don't know all the details of this case, but it's worrying that it raises really, really worrying questions about whether the use of medicine here is coercively forcing this person to cooperate in this police Channel process. Okay, and then my final slide is about confidentiality and criminalization. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So, yeah, as I said, one of the main aims for these hubs really is to circumvent normal confidentiality expectations. So the NHS staff are referred to as an in-house team. And this quote talks about how useful they've found having this in-house team. And it says, the quote at the bottom says, officers reported that prior to the team existing, they had experienced health professionals that somewhat hesitant in sharing potentially important information about their service users with police officers. That's because they, of course, respect confidentiality legislation and guidance. And if there's not a real public health threshold, a public health justification, or it's a genuine safeguarding concern made with consent, then information shouldn't be being shared. But it says the presence of PLAD, which is Prevent Liaison and Diversion, that's the South Hub, London, the Metropolitan Police's one, greatly assisted in this communication. And this happens because, in the report explains, they use this kind of what they call a consultancy model, where the health workers are said to be providing a service primarily to the police and not to the patient concerned. So they're kind of like a loophole in confidentiality kind of guidance and how it works. But we think it's really problematic that these health workers are there seen to be providing a service to police. Okay, I've got 2 more minutes, so I'm actually going to be okay. I just want to add, because it needs to be mentioned, that we think health workers could be potentially implicated in criminalization and through this, because the report makes very clear, based on the documents that the hubs are actually also helping with live investigations, and their information that they help to gather can be used in the pursuit of convictions. So we think, again, that's, you know, highly problematic for the health workers at this hub. And just a really quick word on the overall implications of this. Projects like this and Prevent more broadly in the health sector are only going to foster the already, like, you know, deep-seated mistrust of racialized communities with the healthcare system. And we think, you know, the hub should be scrapped and Prevent should be scrapped. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Hill. Also, sorry that I don't know, I must incite so much fear with my timekeeping, but thanks. Thanks, Vicki. I was under time, so luckily you did actually get an additional 5 minutes. So yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, even though I've read the report, I still find it really shocking to read, for example, the case studies and some of the information that you got from the FOIs. So yeah, thanks very much for that. And there was a question, someone asked in the chat whether the slides would be made available afterwards, but Hill, maybe you can just answer that at the end. You don't need to answer now, or you can answer in the chat box. So I'll just be handing over to Vicki now, who, as I said before, is the head of policy, campaigns and public affairs at the mental health charity Mind. So yeah, please do take it away, Vicki. We can't hear you.
I've got like a double clicker. It's the double clicker that prevented me from talking, but I'm here now. Thank you for letting me know. It's always someone's got to do it, right? So thank you so much for having us along to speak on such an important topic. I want to give a bit of background about Mind and our work, and then focus my comments on exploring those links between mental health problems and terrorism and the resulting stigma from that. So Mind's a mental health charity. We operate in England and Wales, and we campaign for change and provide services like our information service, an online peer support community, and through face-to-face services delivered through our local Minds. We recently launched a new strategy in which we've made a commitment to understand more about the issues that matter to communities, which we haven't done enough to support in the past, and use our voice to speak out when we see injustice. And mental health, radicalisation and terrorism is one of those areas, with race, religion and culture all playing a key role. So to set the scene, it's important to remember that mental health, policing and counterterrorism, they don't exist objectively outside of our societies. They're embedded and influenced by the societies and the institutions, including institutionally racist ones. Just as we've seen how schizophrenia diagnosis has changed from being classified as a non-threatening disease and a diagnosis mainly given to white middle-class women, that shifted in the 60s and 70s to now what we see it as, where it's associated with hostility, mistrust and violence. And subsequently, we've seen much higher rates diagnosed amongst Black men. So it's therefore important that we reflect on the societies and the structures and the bias in our current delivery of mental health care, especially when it intersects with other social institutions such as counterterrorism. So what do we know and understand about these links between mental health and terrorism? In short, not a lot. There's a complex process by which mental health problems combine or interact with other factors during radicalisation, and it's so poorly understood. We know that lone actors can display higher rates of mental health problems than group-based terrorists, and there's more prevalence amongst singular issue attackers when compared to those motivated by right-wing or Islamist ideologies. We also know that there are mental health risk factors in the background of some of those lone actors, but those factors are not uncommon. So we can't pinpoint why in some rare cases people go down that route when the vast majority of people don't. And based on the current evidence, it's not like Prevent or the vulnerability support hubs are picking up on that. We also know that some lone actors are young people who have either had mental health problems or are at increased risk. Others are more loosely described as alienated or troubled that are getting picked up. Nearly every theory out there is deeply contested or not been properly explored. And that's the nub of the problem when it comes to the research around this. So it's no surprise that our lack of understanding about what's really going on results in a set of interventions which either don't work or we don't know if they work or not because people won't give us the evidence. There's no tried and tested tools to identify people who have been radicalised, who are at risk of radicalisation, or who's likely to carry out a terrorist attack. It's done on a case-by-case basis, and therefore the judgment and attitude to risk of the professionals involved. And this is where racism and Islamophobia within counterterrorism and anti-radicalisation interacts with institutionalized racism and a misunderstanding of culture, of religion, of spiritual beliefs, of practice within health and mental health services. And as a result, we've seen significantly higher rates of referrals of Muslims and people of colour into channel, into prevent from health services. And that has such a negative impact on the individuals involved, but also the affected communities at large. We also see this disproportionality in referrals to vulnerability support hubs, which the report so clearly outlines. And of course, there's still hardly any, and after, well, a bit more now you've persevered with your campaign to get those FOIs out, but very little publicly available evidence to help us assess whether the current approaches are working or not. So without that, how can we continue to invest public money in such programmes without knowing what impact they're having or whether they're making the situation better or worse? The result is we end up with a fairly toxic melting point of race and ethnicity, religion, culture, racism, Islamophobia, mental health, dangerousness, it's a classic in mental health, dangerousness, radicalisation and terrorism. And it manifests in different ways to different communities, of course. But the overall impact is on exacerbating any existing mistrust between Muslim, Black, Asian and other ethnic minority communities, exactly like what Hilary was saying beforehand, between those communities and between public health services, including mental health services. This results in people not wanting to or not wanting to come forward to seek help or ask for support. And it's not only that individuals won't seek help and ask for support, it's their families and friends that don't want to encourage their loved ones to seek help for fear of them, of what will happen to them, of them being locked up in some way or another. Because we know that many people who experience mental health problems don't seek help in general. So this is already exacerbating an existing problem that we've got when people are coming forward to talk about mental health. And particularly when it comes to issues around violence, there's often a fear that they're really worried about being stigmatized or locked up if they talk about violent thoughts or urges. So we really need to encourage an openness which allows people to seek help and to access that help more easily. And of course, the knock-on impact, particularly around young people who are caught up in these measures, is of significant concern to us. Sadly, we've seen cuts to services, money not reaching the front line despite promises, increased disruption due to COVID, and increased mental health admissions, particularly for certain diagnoses. But we know that it's actually highly likely all those young people that are struggling with their mental health or have been labelled as at risk or troubled or alienated, this is their language, not ours, would benefit from being able to access culturally competent and age-appropriate services and support. And in a world where that happens, we're likely to see real benefits, including the reduction in the risk of lone act of violence and far fewer unintended consequences of inappropriately labelling young people. The solution, at least in part, can be found in developing programmes of support based on the needs of individuals and communities, ensuring they get the right support at the right time in the right environment. In order to improve society's mental health, we need a much better joined up approach between all different services, social care, education, housing, welfare, policing and health, but not in the way that we're seeing with these vulnerability support hubs, based on mutual trust and understanding with a focus on the individual and what's right for those individuals. The first step is providing that wraparound care is really for government to take a kind of cross-government strategy which puts mental health at the heart of every department's agenda and prioritise mental health, not the other priorities. this situation or this strategy must sit alongside previous commitments that have been made to improve mental health services, because with so many of us still being let down by the services that are meant to help us, urgent action is needed to improve people's day-to-day lives. And finally, when it comes to comments made on the relationship between crime, violence and mental health, we would strongly urge caution. The vast majority of us experiencing mental health problems are unlikely to ever pose a risk to others. We are far more likely to be victims of crime than perpetrators. So we need a much greater understanding on these issues, and that's crucial if we're going to continue to tackle the stigma and discrimination long attached to mental health problems. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was, yeah, really incredible. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. It's just great to get that kind of insight that obviously you have from working at Mind and from Mind's like many, many years working in the mental health field. So thank you so much. So we'll be hearing from, we'll be moving on to hear from Tarek now. But before Tarek starts, I just want to remind you that, yeah, I think my colleague Ben put it in the chat box already, but please do put your questions in the Q&A box. And thank you to those who have already asked questions in there. So yeah, just thanks very much for doing that. And thank you, Vicki. And yeah, please do go ahead, Tarek.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I, first of all, want to just give a quick shout out to Medact and especially Hilary. They did such a fantastic job leading on this report. So I'm going to try to accept Hilary's challenge and perhaps even speak faster than they did. I have a lot to cover. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin with the most obvious statistic that should strike us as odd, which is that a racialized Muslim, according to the statistics, and you can see in the report how we made these calculations, are at least 23 times more likely to be referred to these mental health hubs for Islamism than a white British individual for far-right extremism. Now, I have to here emphasize that this is a very conservative number, because if we look at the report, we'll see also that, for example, one thing we're not including is converts in the way this was calculated. And there are converts who are being referred, white British converts who are being referred to these hubs as racialized Muslims. Second of all, it's really important to understand when we're talking about institutional racism, and Vicki just gave a really, really fantastic overview of this, so I'm not going to dwell on it. We need to always remember that the vast impact of PREVENT can't be reduced to statistics, to referral statistics, right? So the impact of PREVENT, actually, the damage of PREVENT happens before the statistics itself. And of course, the final thing is that, as Vicki also explained, you know, mental health has been riddled with institutional racism, but I'm going to make the argument right now that even if mental health was, quote unquote, an ideal institution that, you know, doesn't have any racism whatsoever, that these mental health hubs would still be a racist apparatus simply through the door of extremism. And I think here, I'll just quickly explain two things. One is about Islamophobia, and then I'm just going to skip actually the points of stigma. When I'm talking about Islamophobia, there's two things I just want to highlight very quickly. First of all, Islamophobia is not necessarily just the sort of hostility towards Muslims in a way that it's often reduced to, but Islamophobia can also be understood in the management of ideal British Muslim thoughts and behavior. This is how PREVENT was also introduced introduced fundamental British values into education. And we need to remember that the vast majority of PREVENT referrals are coming from education. The second thing we need to remember is that perceived Muslimness, the signifiers of Muslimness, is racialized to the threat of terrorism in the public imaginary. This is something that's very well documented in research. When people conjure the idea of a terrorist, the thought of a terrorist, it conjures these racialized Muslim signifiers, racialized Muslimness, or whatever that might appear as. And I thought I read this study recently that I thought was so important, actually, and it's important for this report as well, One was trying to understand how do we understand where the fear of terrorism comes from? And the common presumption is that it comes from a fear of crime, that people fear terrorism because they fear crime. But actually, research has found that the fear of terrorism is actually much more associated with negative attitudes towards Muslims. Now, when it came to this idea of the management of ideal Muslim thought and behavior, I'm drawing here on a policy document within the NHS, which talks about grievances. And I think you need to, again, always come through this door of extremism. How is extremism conjured? And we see through this one slide that, when we're talking about grievances, we'll be talking about a misconception and or rejection of UK foreign policy, distrust of Western media reporting, perceptions that UK government policy is discriminatory. And if anyone is attentive to the way all these points are framed, these are all racialized to Muslims. And is particularly important when we think right now about the context such as Palestine, right? What's the ideal way of talking about Israel and Palestine? And we already know cases by which Palestinian activism has been managed through Prevent. This one case example was very famous in the media, and he alleged that police warned him not to talk about Palestine in school, and further claimed that staff members had approached his 14-year-old brother to stop being so radical. But Prevent Watch has also told me, and Prevent Watch, which collates so many examples of grievances through Prevent referrals, this isn't an isolated case. Often, Palestine is actually very much a reoccurring issue of what's an ideal way to talk about this. Now,
all right, can I just quickly ask you to just put it into presenter mode so that we can see it easier?
Oh, I thought this was presenter.
No, I think it's like your mode. That's, yeah.
Yes, I will do that right away.
Thank you.
Is that better? It's actually better for me as well. So now we understand the way the issue of extremism in and of itself, its racialization, the way it harkens onto particular issues. Now, what I find is very fascinating when you look at this report. Now, the central hubs were unique in that they were doing a mental health assessment for every single person that was being referred. We're talking about adolescents, right? Majority racialized Muslim adolescents that are being referred. And what's interesting is that they found that when making a mental health assessment, they found that most of them had emotional or behavioral dysregulation, which is a very sort of wishy-washy way to say that they have some kind of emotional behavioral issue. There's 2 points to point out here. One has to do with very low distress, and the police themselves remark that's really odd. Why is there so little distress and so high emotional behavioral disorders or other things? And they themselves remarked, oh, we must be overdiagnosing issues of distress into other categories, right? This is what happens when you start making a mental health assessment for everyone. You actually start finding things. But moreover, think about Palestine. Think about so many of the racialized Muslim youth, especially, who feel very helpless, who have these sort of emotional reactions to what's going on in Palestine. The settler colonial project that's occupying Palestine. So how do they feel? How do they react? And is that being right now diagnosed? I'm going to quickly just briefly go over this notion of colorblindness as my second theme. As anyone who's ever heard me speak about this before, one thing that's very interesting that Prevent does is that it recognizes that the threat of terrorism is racialized to Muslims in the public consciousness. And in one way it tries to address that commonsensical association is by sort of raising it and erasing it, by saying here, as you can see in the slide, what factors might make a child vulnerable to radicalization, deprivation, bullying, attending the local mosque, adolescence. And the whole point of this slide, as a very banal sort of anti-racist exercise is that you're not supposed to click attending the local mosque, right? So when you click it, you're told you're wrong, go back, unclick it, and finish and get your prevent certificate. So there's this constant trying to sort of, we'd recognize that Muslims are racialized, and Muslimness is racialized to threat and terrorism, and it's this constant trying to don't be racist, essentially. But another way that actually happens is also through this very generic concepts of psychological vulnerability. We know mental health is a very palpable way of overlooking issues of race, right? We all share a common universal psychological configuration. If I'm vulnerable, if you're vulnerable, anybody who's listening is vulnerable, and this ideological virus infiltrates our minds at the right time, then we can all potentially become terrorists, but that's a way of overlooking that issue. Now, I'm going to quickly just take on these two examples. And we know one of the things that the reports, if you end up reading it, does very well is sort of overlook and completely erase race. So race is absolutely erased in these reports, but they come up constantly, through the subtleties of colorblindness. Either very explicitly in the case on the right, where Mr. X was referred to prevent, following concerns that he had converted to Islam in prison, and then also was acting strangely, right? So here, that's probably one of the few times where it's made very explicit. But if you look at case study number 1 on the left, we see that there's a man who's just acting strangely around London sites, and that caused suspicion. But there is an element of racialization here, which is very, very significant, that's being dismissed. What kind of bodies in public sites will provoke police suspicion over others? But the police are not addressing this in these reports. And of course, these are the cases that are supposed to be made most palpable to get as much funding as possible. Other ways in the report whereby colorblindness is really incredible, and I'm very cognizant I'm almost out of time. We see here in terms of referrals of ideology, you see here extreme right wing, Islamist extremism. Okay, fine. All right, we can assume those are white people, those are racialized Muslims. Oh, suddenly just vulnerable to radicalization, anti-Semitic, threats to commit mass killings and other. Well, the issue here is that if we understand now the racialization of extremism, the racialization of threat, the politicization of particular issues and their associated securitization, we can imagine that everyone here is vulnerable to radicalization might potentially be Muslim, and everyone who was referred for anti-Semitism was Muslim, everyone who's other and and also threatened for mass killing, they're Muslim. So in fact, this is one of the ways in which colorblindness is actually actively employed to avoid the charge of racism. And I'm going to end on this note on migrants and refugees, especially because this is very, very significant. And I'm worried that we're going to underplay the significance of this. In the northern hubs, 48% of the referrals were migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And they explicitly state, sort of vulnerabilities that might be related to their migration history, to their traumas, the sort of interventions that are necessary for that. But, anyone, my background is sort of in cultural psychology, anyone who deals with migrants and refugees, we know the complexity of these cases, right? We're talking about individuals who may have experienced various forms of traumas. And now all of a sudden, there's a very almost egregious link between racialized minorities, i.e., most likely Muslims, migrants, asylum seekers, sort of border policing now, and mental health. And this is all sort of being co-integrated into one hub. And I guess I'll just leave it on this slide. I mean, I think this slide I'd like to just point out is supposed to talk about the groups inspiring extremism with those of the primary diagnosis of schizophrenia or other delusional disorders. As Vicki had mentioned, schizophrenia has a very long history of racialization, and racialized groups have been diagnosed, especially the Black community, have been diagnosed differently. And what's interesting here is that if we think about, first of all, on the one hand, how Muslims may be diagnosed with schizophrenia differently according to the sort of their idioms of distress. If they talk about jinn, if they talk about other things, we know that that's been in the West commonly associated with symptoms of delusion or psychosis, etc. But finally, I'm just going to end with this point. Look at this graph. It's on the left, it has Al-Qaeda, and then it has Daesh, and then it has not available, and then it has not inspired by a specific group, and then not known, and then other group. And I think this graph is just a great way of exemplifying just how so much of the way categories have been created in these hubs, and especially in these reports. I mean, it's unbelievable that something like this would get published, I'll be honest, and it's unbelievable that it's actually served as a basis for even further funding and to be launched nationally. I'll end there.
Thank you, Tarek. Thanks so much. Yeah, interesting to hear specifically you talk about how, yeah, asylum seekers and refugees in the North are being, referred to this hub disproportionately, and that's really worrying. So yeah, thanks very much. I just wanted to highlight to you all that there's now over 120 people in the call, which is really great to see because, yeah, this is just such an important piece of research. And I just think it's really important that people are able to become informed about it and hopefully speak to others about it. But please also do check out the report itself. So we're going to go on now to hear from Dr. Charlotte Heath Kelly, who is an academic at University of Warwick, a reader in politics and international relations. So yeah, please do take it away, Charlotte.
Hi everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here, and I'm very grateful to have been, allowed to contribute to this excellent report. And just the leadership of Medact has just been incredible. I strongly encourage you to please download the report. Also, I strongly encourage you to fact check us because we're very comfortable with that. And Medact have published all of the reports of the internal reports of the hubs alongside our analysis. Some of the cases we're telling you about are pretty extreme. I urge you to check our report and then cross-reference with the the internal evaluation, so that you can see that this is real, this is really happening, and this is horrifying. I'm going to attempt to go through the ethical challenges of the hubs in 10 minutes. These ethical challenges primarily include the transfer of psychiatric techniques associated with forensic medicine, so those who have committed a crime, the transfer of those techniques to pre-crime interventions, also how the activities of healthcare workers are being pushed beyond the health remit through participation with these hubs, the securitization of health, and coercion and pathologization. So you can see that I'm not going to get through all that. Let me start with a story. It might seem very obvious to us that ethical codes are needed to govern psychiatry and psychology. It should strike us as obvious. But you might be surprised to learn that the first codification of psychiatric ethics occurred in only 1977 by the World Psychiatric Association. And there's a particular story of relevance here as to why that happened. What prompted this? Basically, the idea of extremism and the involvement of psychiatric professionals in counterterrorism policing in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had been detaining democracy activists under a quasi-diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia because their ideas were so radically upsetting. This was a horrendous human rights abuse. Western psychiatric associations were so alarmed by what was going on and the reports that they were hearing that they started pushing the World Psychiatric Association to codify ethics specifically around this issue, that the cooperation between psychiatry and policing and intelligence services must be regulated because of what happened in the Soviet Union. And that was what provoked the World Psychiatric Association to develop the first code of ethics, which then proliferated across national professional associations. So the very root of what we're discussing here comes from the securitization of political beliefs and the pathologization as illnesses, and the potential to even detain people on the basis of those kinds of suspicions, which, as we've seen from the case studies earlier, there are 3 in the report where this happens in the UK under the hubs. So I encourage you to think about how far liberal democracy has travelled since the 70s, where we were happy to completely forbid this through codes of ethics, and how far things have slipped since then with the practices that are in this report that we are releasing today. Our first major concern with the ethical issues involved here, we've kind of highlighted under the label of activities beyond the health remit. So when you talk to people involved in the hubs, they like to tell you that this is about providing pathways to mental health care for people that have been referred to Prevent. I think we've conclusively shown today that most of them are either already in contact with mental health services or do not have any mental illness to be diagnosed. There's very few that actually sit in the middle that weren't in contact with services but needed services. So what are they actually doing? The Northern Hub in particular, please do check the internal evaluation reports. The Northern Hub has predominantly been practicing something they call disruptive safeguarding. And this seems to be the practice of the hub, the psychiatrist accessing a person's medical information from the local mental health team and then giving it to the counterterrorism police to assist prosecution. This disruptive safeguarding is completely alien to the ethical guidelines that are provided by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, where if you are collaborating with the police, the college underlines that you've got to be very careful about the dual allegiance that you have in that situation, and you need to put a great emphasis on the patient's best interests. So to be pursuing prosecution and accessing their data and sharing that data strikes us as quite troubling, to say the least. Furthermore, the disruptive the activities behind the health remit, as Hilary showed us earlier, the hubs are asking mental health practitioners to monitor specific cases and refer information on worrying speech and tripwires back to them. So this is obtaining this information basically to pathologize their political beliefs. We've already heard about the case of the man who was found to be suspiciously visiting tourist sites in London and was found to be risky, and then was referred by the London counterterrorism police into the mental health hub to be assessed there. And on the basis of those suspicions, there was a decision, because he was visiting tourist sites, there was a decision to intensify his treatment regime. Obviously, we don't have all the details because the internal documents don't provide them, but think about the case studies that they would present and why they would present them. They think these are the best case studies. They think that this is, what they want to show to their funders to ask for more money, and that is all over the evaluation documents, is the need for more funding for the hubs. Okay, so securitization of health. There's a few cases that we outline in the report that we've drawn from the internal documents where Prevent officers are attending mental health assessments in people's homes. Now, that's a process that seems to have come over from forensic psychiatric practice, where if the police feel that the person might become violent and they have to have good reason for this, then the police can attend with them to protect the staff during the assessment. But we don't get that sense from these internal documents at all. That's never mentioned. Instead, the presence of the Prevent officer seems to be linked to identifying ideological content and flagging if there is a risk there or not that's associated with counterterrorism. All extremely dubious, given that there's no real valid scientific basis for this. So we've got mental health assessments, police coming to your home with a warrant and doing a mental health assessment with a psychiatrist there, and sometimes more than one police officer. It's pretty violent. Furthermore, there's plenty of cases where medication regimes have been put under increased surveillance through the activities of the hubs, communicating with the practitioners at the local level, including people's medication being drastically upped. On the basis of police suspicions, not any crime, not any kind of conduct that's been committed, just suspicion. And as we've heard very much, 2 minutes, I see it, emphasized very well by Tarek, that these suspicions are racialized in the vast majority of cases. So this is not okay. And I encourage you to check the report for the details of the 3 people who ended up sectioned in inpatient care after police concerns were passed through the hubs to the local mental health teams. They were already under the care of mental health teams. So what kind of suspicions and what kind of influence did those police suspicions have that led to these people being sectioned? And then suddenly, in the case that Hilary showed us, sudden willingness after that to cooperate with Prevent after being sectioned. I mean, that's very worrying to us on the basis of potential coercion. There is no discussion of consent for mental health assessments in the internal documents at all. It's just not there. And as we know from previous studies of Prevent, it just doesn't happen a lot of the time. Consent is not obtained most of the time. Sub-diagnostic thresholds are being employed by the central hub in particular. 1 minute, I see it. This really worries us because it's so vulnerable to the influence of like racialized suspicions. So a lot of the people deemed to have complex needs, in the words of the central hub, they actually just have behavioral or emotional difficulties, which is a much vaguer conception, and it's certainly not defined as a mental illness specifically. And they use a formulation approach, and this is being rolled out nationally now, a formulation approach to weave this together in a narrative about how someone's situation as an asylum seeker or as a migrant or as a homeless person or as an unemployed person, how those situations of precarity influence a decision about terrorism risk and one's mental state. And all these factors come together in a very vague and unspecified way so that people are flagged as red, amber, or green on the basis of this combined assessment. And as I've got to finish now, I really want to highlight that there's no evidence base for this. There's also no crime that's been committed that could allow such steps to be taken. Rather, this is all operating in the pre-crime space on the basis of suspicion and referral to Prevent. And you do not get referred to Prevent if you've actually done something. You get referred to Pursue and the counterterrorism police if you've actually committed a crime. So this is explicitly people who have done nothing wrong. And that really horrifies me. And I'll stop there and encourage you to read the report, because I did not meet Hilary's challenge to get through the final points.
Thank you, Charlotte. I think you did a brilliant job, actually. So yeah, don't be hard on yourself. I thought you got through a lot in there. And I think like really kind of provided a lot of context and background for people who are joining us today. Because I know a lot of the kind of content within the report is like quite technical. So I think it is good to get that kind of overarching just background behind the hubs and the concerns with it. So yeah, thanks so much to all of our really brilliant speakers who also mostly stayed like pretty much on time, so we're not running that much over. And yeah, I just wanted to now kind of open out to the Q&A. We've already had quite a lot of questions in the Q&A box and a lot of really good questions as well. So just wanted to say, if you are still going to submit a question in the Q&A box, you can do so anonymously. Yeah, so I'm just going to start off by reading out questions. We're going to do 3 at a time. And just a note for the speakers, I'd really appreciate if when you're responding, you could just be as like kind of short and concise as possible, just so that we can try to have at least 2 rounds of questions, because we have so many good questions in the box. So yeah, I'll just start off and I'm going to read 3 out at a time. So, first question, are there limits to cultural competency in services? It seems to be the new buzzword for mental health trusts and charities, but not sure how culturally competent you can be without challenging the political status quo. And that's from an anonymous question. Another one, could I ask a more technical question about how the referral system works? Potentially a good one for you, Hill. Can those working outside the police refer directly, or is it always that once a referral is made to Prevent, that the police can choose to refer it into the hubs? And do the hubs communicate back with their assessments to GPs or community mental health teams? And that's from Kitty Worthing. And another question, let me just see. Does the whole notion around terrorism or extremism being a mental health issue or something detected psychologically not mirror early racist ideas about the inferior biology or brains of non-white races, or does this observation seem too far-fetched? And that's from Nihal Abdullah. And that, yeah, so I don't know if I need to repeat the first question around cultural competency in mental health trusts and charities. And yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I can take it, but I think I'd be interested in others' views on this as well. I mean, you're right. It does. There's always buzzwords flying around in the mental health world and in the wider health world. I mean, I think at Mind we've been talking about cultural competency for a number of years now, but it's. I think you're right. I think it probably isn't quite fit for purpose now. I think it's what we've got at the moment in a way that talks to those issues, but it doesn't really get under the bonnet, so to speak, of some of the broader issues around political and power imbalances, and what that means. So I think we're going to need to have a new language around that, a better language, a smarter language, something that's a bit more meaningful, because what we do know that mental health services, it's great to have, it becomes a tick box, and you're like, oh, culturally competent, done that with the minimum of effort and not really getting into the heart of what I think some of the fundamentals are around that. So that's a really great question, actually, and so I think you're right, and I'm going to take that away and go back to the team and say, can we think of do we need to think of our own language in that, rather than just repeating something which is probably not fit for purpose now? So thank you.
Can I add something to that very quickly?
Yeah.
So just in addition to what Vicki was saying, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that cultural competency is practiced differently, actually, in different settings, and there's different understandings of it, whereby they might just do ethnic matching, or there's other ways of doing it. But I just want to highlight, actually, specifically in relation to Prevent and in terms of a consequence of it. I think when more and more people learn about me, I've been getting more and more people seeking therapy, and they're seeking not cultural competency, right? They're not, for example, if they're Muslim, they're not asking for a racialized Muslim, they're asking for someone who's politically conscious and politically aware of Prevent. So we've almost, I think, reached the limits of cultural competency. In the United States, there's Jonathan Metzl, for example, he talks about structural competency, so having an understanding of these policies and how they might potentially impact the therapeutic space. But I think we really need almost politically conscious competency, but that's one which sort of goes already directly in confrontation with the policies, with the settings themselves, right? With the policies in the mental health settings. So much so, I've actually even had people who are not racialized Muslims come to me because they know, oh, this person is politically safe to share my concerns with. Even though they might not have any particular grievances, they just don't like the idea of a securitized setting. So that's probably one of the biggest things that we need to, one of the biggest gaps, I think, right now in the shadow of Prevent.
Thanks, both. Yeah,
Sorry, should I come back on the second question, which is about how the referral process works, a bit of a technical one? Yeah, as far as we can understand from the hub documents, this isn't something that people are being referred directly to from any other service. It's a sort of second step. So once people are referred to Prevent from health or from prison or from education, then police, if they suspect this person has a mental health condition, can refer to the hubs. But yes, then the hubs, even if that person has been referred from health to Prevent to a hub, will then go back to the health services and to communicate with them, usually to request information, or it seems to kind of seek to influence the risk assessments being made by those health professionals. So that's GPs, community mental health teams, a lot. So I hope that answers your question, Kitty.
I can try and answer Nihal's question on the eugenics history and if there's a link. I'm working on a project right now that's going to take a while longer to really finish the answer to this, but looking at the history of how these ideas kind of transferred through eugenics movement, through the earliest ideas of kind of anticipatory crime prevention, all the way through the 20th century, as they try and they kind of change slightly. There's the long story. Basically, the answer is yes, there is a link. There is a historical process of transfer of these ideas that originally associated in a very blunt way racialized status with deficiency. They've changed across the years, but they still echo through this kind of crime prevention discourse and now extremism prevention discourse. How they change, the one thing I'll say about this is that they're far more insidious now and very dangerous. They remain very dangerous because they are so insidious, because they hide behind the language of risk factors. So rather than taking the individual body, individual racialized body, it's broken up now in the discourse around prevention, that it's called dividuation, to move to the tiny microscopic factors that make up the individual. So it kind of appears less racist unless you choose to really look into it and get the stats and the figures as to what's going on here, or really analyze the language. So yes, there is a link. It's far more insidious these days than it used to be, and I hope that goes some way to answering the question.
Thanks so much. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that, or if we should go to the next round of questions. Okay, let's go to the next round. I mean, there's now 31 questions in the box, which is really incredible. And I just want to say we're obviously not going to be able to get to all of those questions, but if the speakers are okay with it, you know, I would just like to invite those who feel like their questions haven't been answered to email Medact saying, oh, I would like to, you know a bit more about this, and potentially we can then, you know, put forward that to the relevant speaker. So yeah, just to say, because there's so many great questions and I don't want to lose them all. So another round of questions. We have a question from Rachel Piper asking, how does it link to the Serenity Integrated Mentoring or SIM scheme and the Stop SIM campaign? And we've got another question from Mashal Iftikhar, who's a core psychiatric trainee, who asks, what legal backing do we have, if any, to resist being co-opted into handing over patient information to mental health workers colluding with police or doing mental health assessments for police to gather information? And then a final question specifically for Charlotte. How would you respond to the argument that Prevent is concerned with safeguarding and protecting the vulnerable in the pre-crime space? The Prevent discourse often compares Prevent to children at risk, exploitation, preventing children getting involved in gangs. How would you counter that safeguarding argument in the pre-crime space? And that's from Sean Calvin. So I don't know who wants to start off. The question about SIM.
Yeah, I can take SIM. And for those of you that don't know, do have a look online around the Stop SIM campaign. The organisers of that have been doing an incredible job, and I think actually quite a lot of us included, quite a lot of us were really surprised that this was actually happening, and it's a scheme which is largely where there are linkages. I think it's because it's the relationship between the health and the police again, so it's in a different context, but it's essentially people with complex needs, normally have a personality disorder diagnosis, but it's police led, and what's really disturbing about it, once we'd got our heads around that this was happening, is about how was it commissioned, how has it been adopted when there's no evaluation, and it also appears to be contravening NICE guidance, including the withholding of medical support. So it feels like a very clear overreach from the police into the kind of health space. So there are definite parallels to be taken, and we need, it's not like the police haven't got a role within mental health, because they will often be the first port of contact, particularly for people in a crisis. But somehow we've got a disconnect between, and an imbalance between how those two agencies should be working together, and it's clearly gone wrong somewhere on the SIM model. So it's a great question, Rachel, and there is definite parallels which we need to understand, but there's also things about how are these things allowed to happen without evidence, without evaluation, and then they just get rolled out, and no one seems to have picked up on this apart from individuals saying, this is bad and it's having a terrible impact on individuals that are going through it. So it's definitely one to watch, but we've been talking to the campaign about that and where we can best support them on that. So yeah, definitely one to watch.
Thanks a lot, Vicky. Thanks for responding to that, and thanks, Rachel, for that question. So the next question was around what legal backing do we have, if any, to resist being co-opted into handing over patient information? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that.
Hill, you take it then.
Confidentiality expectations are set out in the NHS guidelines. They are also, in common law, there's a common law duty of confidentiality. There's a public interest in confidentiality, confidential medical care, because otherwise, this is going to erode trust overall. So the safeguards already exist. The problem is they have been eroded for a long time in many different ways. It's not just the hubs, it's Prevent for a long time has been eroding confidentiality guidelines, lowering the thresholds, conflating public interest justifications with safeguarding, using prevention of crime exceptions for data sharing. I don't know, do you want to add something, Charlotte, perhaps?
I can link to the next question. Actually, I think I can link quite nicely, which is about how to counter the argument that Prevent is safeguarding and protection, because confidentiality comes through significantly in that. So to answer that one and to make the link in 2 steps, why is Prevent not legitimately safeguarding? As many of our audience members are healthcare or social care practitioners, they'll be familiar with what the definition of safeguarding is and the requirements that need to be in place before someone can act from a health or social care background in the interests of another human being. And I can't remember the exact wording, but it's you'd have to have core needs very specifically outlined in the medical guidance that would prevent you from being able to defend yourself against some form of abuse. And this abuse, there's lots of them listed that people should be protected against. Violent abuse. There's a lot of them. I've gone blank because it's the evening, but it's a very strict threshold for, you have to have a significant kind of impairment that means you can't defend yourself, and then a healthcare worker can make a safeguarding referral on your behalf. Now, the hubs and Prevent have been driving a 10-ton truck through this definition of as a foundation of safeguarding and when it can be used. Basically, the threshold for care needs no longer applies because the definition of extremism is thought to just bend that out of all proportion. So there's always this impairment. Radicalization is like this permanent state of impairment that could be applied to any of us at any time. Well, we're vulnerable to radical ideas, therefore we both have a care need to be protected, but also we can't defend ourselves against the external radicalizer who's acting on us. They just drive a truck through this understanding of what a need is, and what abuse is. Ideological abuse? I mean, really? Is that a thing? Apparently so. The second one, and to make the link to Hilary's point as to why Prevent and the hubs really shouldn't be considered safeguarding, is that you have to obtain someone's consent unless there's very strict criteria to share their information to ensure a safeguarding response. Again, a 10-ton truck has been driven through this. In fact, the Prevent Guidance for Mental Health is literally a document on how to subvert those structures of confidentiality and information sharing. It's available online, published by the Department of Health. It's literally guidance on how to sidestep the need to obtain consent, and instead to proceed without consent to share information on the basis of risk that violence is going to happen. Now, where that used to be, had to be a really defined threat that violence was going to happen imminently, and that, you know, a defined threat had been voiced, that's now been expanded to pretty much anything. And, you know, we see safeguarding referrals made for children. You know, what kind of a threat is posed by a 6-year-old child that their information can be shared without the consent of the family? I mean, it's pretty ludicrous, but it's the sustained erosion of those care needs threshold and confidentiality foundations for safeguarding.
Thanks very much, Charlotte. I wonder if maybe there's time to, oh, Tarek, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to mention just really quickly one point, just adding to Charlotte, because Charlotte just hit all the nails on the head. When you read through the reports, you're going to note that the police, when they're talking about the institution of these mental health hubs, the whole point of them is also to reduce false negative referrals, right? And which also contravenes with the spirit of safeguarding. What a false negative referral actually means is that it's really best to refer anyone the moment you have any suspicion of anything, right? Which is what Charlotte is talking about. So it actually completely almost throws on top of his head, whereby you might have even the smallest minutia of concern for something, and to always constantly operate upon it, it actually completely dilutes the very institution of safeguarding at that point. Because, you know, as we know in London public transport, you know, see it, say it, sorted. Are you going to say see it, say it, sorted is also safeguarding? You know, is every single time I have some kind of suspicion towards somebody in any way, shape, or form, is that safeguarding, right? So we have to sort of draw the logic backwards of what they're actually trying to achieve, and you can see it. It's black on white. They speak about that very frequently, about reducing false negatives. Try to get as many people, because a false negative is actually missing out on a potential referral.
Thanks, Tarek. So I think that there's time for maybe just a couple more questions. I'm gonna ask this one from Timothy Malone. How are the Royal College of Psychiatrists, the GMC, the CQC responding to this? Are these not the organizations that are there to protect patients and regulate the ethics and behavior of doctors working in the sector and sound the alarm bells across society? Are they failing in their duty to protect patients and regulate psychiatrists? And then the last question, is there work being done to bring together health workers, teachers, and social workers to oppose all this? And that's from David Lando. So I think he'll, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I could come back on the first one. We really are expecting, hoping, waiting for the Royal College of Psychiatrists and the General Medical Council, and potentially also the Care Quality Commission, to make some public statements and to act and speak out against these hubs. It's unclear to us exactly how much the Royal College of Psychiatrists have known about these hubs, but they know something about them going on because they're quoted in the article from 2017 that I talked about very rapidly at the beginning of the call. And they have issued, position statements on psychiatry and counterterrorism, and they have issued a document called Ethical Considerations, which actually speaks very, very closely to the concerns raised in the report and that the hubs raised. So we think that they, certainly have had some idea of what's going on in these hubs, but we'd like to see them come out, openly challenge them, because they've made commitments to challenging racism on the back of Black Lives Matter, and the hubs are deeply Islamophobic, so we'd like to see them sort of put their money where their mouth is, as it were. And the same with the GMC, we think they should urgently look at whether health workers are acting beyond the health remit at these hubs, and also whether counterterrorism police have created, in effect, loopholes which circumvent confidentiality. So if you are a member of those organizations or you have any sway, please get in touch. Please let us know that, lobby those organizations. Or, we'd love to hear from you if you'd like to speak more, if you're a member. And Reeve, should I pass back to you for the final question about perhaps what activism is being done?
Yeah, thanks, Hill. So after the publication of our false positives report last year on prevent in the NHS, a number of health workers and also people from other kind of public sectors, so including higher education, including people affected by prevent itself. So whether that's, family members or of people who were referred to prevent or people who are referred to prevent themselves, we came together to try to think through, what can be done to challenge something like prevent, or to challenge more broadly like counter extremism, securitization policies in healthcare. Of course, like the difficulty, for example, with prevent is that it's a legal duty, it's a statutory duty. Professionals have a duty to undertake the trainings if asked, with it if they work for the NHS. So the difficulty is a lot of the time people feel very isolated when they try to challenge this in the workplace, particularly if they're racialized in some way, or if they are more junior. And so I guess what we created the securitization of health group, and we in that group we kind of provide a space to be able to support each other to raise issues with prevent within a professional setting in some way, and also we've created like a pack, like what we've called a mutual aid pack for people who may have been affected by prevent in some way, whether that's because they have to undertake the training, whether it's because they feel like they've been discriminated against as a result of prevent in the workplace, or whether it's because they themselves were referred to prevent. And within that, it has legal pointers for people who want to challenge their referral in some way. And then we have other pointers for ways that people can challenge. So we point people towards their trade union branches, saying that we can together support each other to raise that within that kind of trade union collegiate context. But another way is, we're running these, we feel like it's really important to just educate people about the issues of kind of securitization within healthcare. And so we're running these alternative trainings on prevent. Yes, please, Ben. We're running these alternative trainings on prevent in healthcare for people, and we've called it that because people obviously have to go to the prevent trainings, but often there's just not the space. Often it's like an e-learning, they can't even challenge it in person, they just have to sit through it and then that's it. So we've created the space where people can have more critical engagement, where they can come to information, other information about prevent, and find out ways of how they can get involved in a collective who are trying to challenge it. So the next alternative training on prevent is next week on Tuesday at 6 p.m. So that's the 25th. So you can register for that on our website. And I would really encourage you to do that, because it is just a good way of finding out more. And we also, you know, we've created a pack on our website that's like frequently asked questions on Prevent, because often people just feel very, you know, nervous about even responding to questions about Prevent, you know, the classic questions of, but what's the alternative? Don't we want to stop terrorism? And so I think it's just a good way of coming and like being able to like educate yourself, and then to educate your colleagues, and that kind of creates the building blocks of like a ground shift on Prevent. So yeah, I would really encourage you to do that. So I think we're gonna have to start to wrap up. We won't be able to take any more questions, but I did put in the chat box the email address that you can email if you have further questions, and it's just office@medact.org. Because I am, yeah, just very aware that there were loads of really great questions, and I wish we had the time to get into it all. So yeah, I just want to thank our speakers again, who did just such a great job. And I also wanted to just let you know that you can, there's, I think, Ben, are you putting a master, oh yeah, there it is. So if you look in the chat box, there's like a master, there's a document, I don't know what it's called, a document that has all these different links in. So links for you to register to the event next week, links to the report from today that we've just been discussing today, a link to the report from last year on Prevent, and then links on how you can actually join the mailing list of the Securitization of Health group, where you'll get regular updates about our events and how you can get involved. And then, yeah, just to say as well that please do sign up to our mailing list, and you'll be kept in up to date about any future events, any future reports, blogs, etc. And you can also sign up to be a member of Medact by paying as little as £1 a month. And we're only able to do the work that we do through the support and dedication of our members. Our members play such a huge part in all of the work that we do. And yeah, it would just be great to see some of you becoming, you know, active members of Medact. So yeah, just thank you so much to everyone who attended. There's still 100 people here, and it's 8:30, which is really amazing. I'm quite hungry, so I'm amazed you guys have stuck it out. So thanks so much. And thanks again to the speakers and to Ben and TJ, who've been doing a lot today too. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.